Members and friends of Trinity Church, welcome. Welcome this morning to our continued series, Race and Trinity Church. This series that we're having over a couple of weeks is one where we are, in an overview fashion, looking a little bit at the intersection of race and our history here at Trinity Church, ultimately a little bit of the history of race in our diocese, and then also within our city, and also how Trinity Church interacts and overlays with that history. As we said last week, this is a little bit of a repeat. We did this series a couple of years ago, in person, of course, and we thought this was a great opportunity to go ahead and do it once again here in this format, so even more people could partake and could be a part of this conversation, as this is one of the immediate questions in our life and in our greater culture. So we want to be sure as many people are able to touch this history as possible. Also, we are considering, my colleague here, David, and I, two white guys, having this conversation. But one of the aspects that's important is that we know ourselves. So as we have described in the past, that we're considering this a family conversation about family history. It is not primarily a greater community-wide conversation about race today and our actions on how we all partake in changing the dynamic of inclusion and diversity in our greater society. We are involved in those conversations, but that is not what we are leading with in this. This is a preliminary for us to really get there, to really know who we are. So, David,
I think one of the things that you and I have both kind of come to realize as we've been talking and looking through our history is that there's still a lot of history that we've discovered we need to know that we don't have. I mean, part of the problems with any kind of historical record is you often will get one kind of version of history, as we kind of talked about last week, and this will show up as we go through the conversation. So we just acknowledge at the outset that we understand that this is a part of the history, and some of it maybe we can find and research, and maybe that's a project that ought to be done, and some of it may continue to be an area of silence just because we don't have records of everything, and history gets told from one certain perspective often. So today we're starting at the beginning, right?
Right. We're really covering these very early years. And let's just jump right into what those early years are. Because as you mentioned, we are lacking a lot of history in between history. But the history of Trinity Church starts in 1849. Mm-hmm. So much before the Civil War begins, but not much before the question of slavery begins. The question of slavery is a hotbed already by 1849, but Trinity's history begins in 1849, and it begins with women. It begins with women
leading the way.
Leading the way. This is a common history in the Episcopal Church. The church I grew up in on the island of Aquidneck Island in Newport, Rhode Island, was started by Sarah Gibbs, who wanted to start a seminary. And so a similar history here in Asheville for Trinity Church. And that history is with Henrietta Carr Patton. Her husband owned a hotel up on the Eagle Hotel up on Biltmore. And there was a clergy person traveling through town, Jarvis Buxton, who was the rector of St. John's Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And rumor has it, as it's told in the history, is that Henrietta was at the Eagle Hotel and attacked, so to say, Jarvis Buxton, saying, pleading with him to start a parish here in Asheville. And it just so happened that his son was studying for the ministry at General Seminary, my seminary, at the time. And so he thought this would be a great location for his son.
Also named Jarvis Buxton.
Also named Jarvis Buxton. So yes, we can't get them mixed up. There is the Jarvis Buxton daddy, who is buried at St. John's in Fayetteville, and the Jarvis Buxton son, who is buried here at the Riverside Cemetery, originally buried here on the property of Trinity, and then moved with all the other graves at some point to Riverside Cemetery. So ultimately, Jarvis Buxton becomes the first rector of Trinity Church. And we have this wonderful picture of the very first church built on this property. Now, that's the other piece of information. The property, Henrietta is married to James Patton, who's a Presbyterian at the time. and she pleads with him to give this property that we are on right now for the purposes of an Episcopal church, which he does, and then he becomes an Episcopalian. How this goes in families.
Well, and so I just want to point out also something about our first rector, Jarvis Buxton. If you're familiar with Asheville, kind of the South Slope, that was where Jarvis Buxton lived as the rector, and
all south of Trinity Church.
Yeah, and so we have a very well-known barbecue joint now that is named Buxton Hall, and it was named after that area, which was kind of named after Jarvis Buxton. So unbeknownst to Buxton Hall, they're actually named after our first rector, Jarvis Buxton. I know that's a pretty trivial kind of thing, but I find it fascinating how, because I think it speaks to how Trinity's foundational families and people really are located throughout Trinity's history. I mean, throughout Asheville's history. I mean, Trinity does operate in a fairly central place in the history of Asheville.
Right. So Jarvis Buxton, south of us, as you're saying, had a farm, apparently, going all the way down to South Side Street, that street that goes from over McDowell over to Biltmore. And there is the Buxton Street down there, which Buxton Hall Barbecue is on. And he is the rector of Trinity Church for this whole Civil War period and Reconstruction, the beginning of Reconstruction, 1849 to 1891, I believe. So he really is the leader through all of this history. The history we do not have much of in terms of the clergy leadership and their relationship to both Reconstruction, be it Jim Crow, segregation, is that 1891 up until the rectorship of John Tootin in 1947. So 1891 to 1947, that history is something we can still discover.
And it's a significant history in terms of race in Asheville. You've got everything from the era of lynching, which we do know there were some lynchings in Buncombe County, to also the right up until the post-World War II era, where you had kind of the post-GI Bill, which has some implications in race and access to land and home ownership. So this is a significant period of silence that we have that really probably could use additional resources and additional research, which we are probably at the library. And so maybe this is a project for later, but we do have a fair amount of our founding families and our founding rectors. And so that's kind of some of our focus today, because we have some good, charming history. And then we also have that side of history that maybe makes us a little bit more uncomfortable, but needs to be spoken and said aloud. And that's kind of our relationship and Trinity's relationship to slavery in the area. A lot of people assume that Western North Carolina and Appalachians didn't have slaves. It was the eastern part of the state that had, and certainly it was more prevalent there, but slavery did exist here. I mean, we have families in our history, in our early history, that were slave owners, right?
Yes, including Jarvis Buxton himself.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, our first rector. He had three
Right.
slaves, I believe.
That's the history that I understand. So here we have Jarvis Buxton, the rector of Trinity Church, is a slave owner, 1849, before the Civil War. Now, as was James Patton, who much of that history is part of this history of Asheville, of course. And he was a large slave owner. And then we have his son, Thomas, also at Trinity, a member of Trinity. And his history is interesting as well. The piece that is important for us to know is that, well, let's talk a little bit about the Civil War era and the information that we have about the way in which Jarvis Buxton and Thomas Patton, James's son, handled that whole Civil War time. And it is coupled with a conversation we'll be having next week,
right,
about Trinity's relationship to what was originally called Trinity Chapel, now called St. Matthias Church, African American Episcopal Church. Neighbors to us now. In those early days, this whole area of the city was farmland in many ways.
And I think part of what we can do is point to some sources that if folks want to read more about this that are available. We've got several books, including our own Trinity history. We've got history of race in the Diocese of Western North Carolina, written by Jim Abbott, who'll be with us next week. Also, the professor at UNCA, Darren Waters, has written a lot about this particular period in history in Asheville, and Trinity gets some mentions in there. I think one of the things that I found fascinating was that Jarvis Buxton was actually a chaplain for the Confederate soldiers who were stationed in Asheville. And this was part of his calling, was ministering to the Confederate soldiers who were here in Asheville. And I won't say it a charming anecdote about him, but when the Union troops, when the states troops came in to kind of free the slaves and put it kind of into the Confederate rebellion and the secession, Jarvis Buxton canceled services that next Sunday because he refused to pray for the president in Abraham Lincoln. And he was not going to do it. He was not going to do it. So he canceled services that first Sunday. And then, of course, he resumed services. But it's a fascinating piece that kind of speaks to where people's minds are in the midst of this kind of conflict and war. So anyway, I mean, this is part of that's part of our history too. Now, James Patton, like you said, was one of the largest slave owners in our county. And up until the time he died, which was right around the Civil War era, he was actively advocating for continued slavery, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, emancipation of the slaves. He was actively writing to the state's government to try to pass laws which eventually became known as the Black Codes, which restricted for the freedom of freed slaves, freed people in North Carolina. But what's interesting is seeing kind of the slight change in direction that happens with his son and attitudes and perspectives. We should probably preface this by saying none of this makes anything what we're going to say. None of this makes folks abolitionists. I would not qualify any of this as kind of like suddenly we've had a conversion to being abolitionists.
Right.
I think had the Civil War not happened, slaveholding would have continued in this area for a long, long time. So let's not have rose-colored glasses on when it comes to this, right?
Sure.
Let's
talk a little bit about. Let's talk a little bit about along those lines. I mean, there are clear histories in many congregations that with really specific histories that many of us would bristle at. And as you say, we don't have the histories of African Americans that were present at Trinity at the time. But unlike my former parish in Raleigh, Christ Church, where there is specific history on how African Americans were treated, not allowed to partake in communion, had to sit in balconies, so on and so forth. We're not suggesting there wasn't segregation present in Trinity's history, but we don't. Let's talk a little bit about the ways in which both Jarvis Buxton, even given his attitudes right after the slaves were freed, as well as Thomas Patton, the son and Confederate soldier, and as well as another Confederate soldier and member of Trinity Church. Let me find it, Mr. Martin, General.
Well, and just to kind of add on to that, one of the ways that historians have gathered the perspectives of former slaves who were freed is that they have gone around in projects in a massive nationwide project to gather these stories, and they fall under the large umbrella of slave narratives. They're called slave narratives.
Right.
And there are a lot of those in North Carolina. There are a lot fewer of those in Western North Carolina. But anytime you read those, it's really eye-opening, and you get this completely other perspective of history. So anytime you've got a chance to read those, it's such an illuminating thing. And if I were to ever come across or find these for Western North Carolina, it would be a real treasure to be able to read some of that. But we don't have that, unfortunately.
Right.
So we're left to kind of piece together history from what we know, and allow some silence as well.
The interesting piece, and we'll get to more details on this in next week's program, is how Jarvis Buxton, James Patton, and Major General James G. Martin, who was part of the Confederate Army as well. We do have these little hints of attitudes and perspectives that give us some information. And regarding Jarvis Buxton himself, again, even given what you said, his reaction was to the outcome of the war.
Right.
He conducted the first service for the emancipated slaves of Trinity, a separate service, but nevertheless, both Jarvis Buxton, Major General James G. Martin, and James Patton's son Thomas were involved in coming together very quickly. I mean, this is within a year of the Civil War ending, and providing the land for what was called Trinity Chapel, now St. Matthias Church, but Trinity Chapel. And there may be something to be said about this shift from that moment when Jarvis Buxton said, "I'm not going to pray for the president," and the way in which they entered into this new world in this new time. We do have plenty of history from this time when something like providing both education, which the new Trinity Chapel did for African Americans, as well as worship space, would never have been done. There was still major resistance.
Literacy was a huge barrier for freedmen and women at that time, because previously Southern states had laws prohibiting the teaching of slaves to read. And so this kind of pivot I find significant, because in my reading, and I could be wrong, in my reading, it seemed to me that most of the time, in order to have a school for the freed slaves, for emancipated slaves, for our brothers and sisters of color at that time, that money was coming in from the North and from organizations in the North. And so this strikes me as at least interesting and something worth exploring. Again, not saying this is a shift to full-on abolitionism and equality, or that this was perfectly motivated as anti-racist or anything like that. I don't think we're saying that, but it is something I think worth thinking about as part of our history. Even somebody like Thomas Patton, it's clear that his father had certain very wrong attitudes about slaves and slavery. But then we have these letters that Thomas had written his mom during the war and shortly after about actually saying that the law's wrong about treating people of color this way. Again, he couches it in terms of like his lifelong slave, which he considered a friend, going with him. And he says, the law's wrong. This person should be my friend. The color of his skin should not decide whether he's free or not. Now, a lot of people are going to focus on this family bit because this was a common thing amongst slaveholders to consider their slaves family. Oftentimes, slaves did not consider their families, the slaveholders, their family. But what's significant, I think, to me is that he's literally saying, I think the law is wrong.
Right. Right.
And I think this has been a mistake. And again, it's not perfect, but it's worth pondering what it says about that quick pivot, which I think is unusual for this area and for the South immediately after the Civil War, to not only begin a school, but to have a slaveholding family gift part of their wealth, part of their land, to people of color. And I know we'll get into more of that next week. So to be able to kind of talk about the evil institution of slavery and how people of our founding history participated in it, and also how they began to extricate themselves from it, and at least in a small way, try to change. I mean, I see this at least as a partial change at the very least.
Right.
Again,
and then at a time where other examples in other both congregations and dioceses, there was a very strong resistance, and this type of thing did not take.
I mean, and ideally what we would like to have seen was before the Civil War, everybody freed their slaves.
Right.
And worked towards the true siblinghood of all of God's children. I mean, that's the gospel, right? I mean, but we live in an incredibly flawed world, and this is the history that we have to kind of look at. And so I think we can both name the evil that is present in our history and also see how some folks began to work out of that evil, because I think that actually carries significance for us today when we are still dealing with the legacy of racism and slavery. How do we name that and then begin to move away from that in some meaningful ways? Again, not perfect.
Not perfect, but interesting at none the least. Another interesting part is that it wasn't just this kind of, well, we're going to give the land to this, you go do it. We do know that Major General Jim Martin and his wife actually were teachers at the school,
right.
And partook in educating the freed slaves of the area, which is interesting because we know that one of the real desires in this system was to not educate African American Black citizens because obviously education meant, let me get out of here type of thing. And so they're all interesting pieces. So anyway, David, this is this early history, as we said, this 1849 to 1891 when Jarvis Buxton dies, and so after 1891, we get a series of rectors at Trinity Church who have a short-term stays. And there's how many of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from 1891 to 1915. This rapid turnover of rectors. Just when there is this kind of reconstruction area, laws are beginning that develop into what we would call the Jim Crow laws. This is where a lot of our history is not well known, but we don't have any information, at least that we know of, that we have to say that any of those rectors, we probably have some information about some members, right, and member families, but any of those rectors were involved in, well, let's say Klan activity or leaders on the forefront of advocating for segregation,
Right.
in those ways. It might be there,
Right. Right.
but we don't know of it. And then, of course, the beloved Jack Tootin comes to Trinity Church in 1947.
Right.
I mean, it's hard for us to consider this, but his rectorate is a huge part of leading up to the civil rights era, and through, not just up to, but through the civil rights era at Trinity Church. So his rectorate alone is a huge piece of the history of Trinity Church. So there's a little bit about our early history and Trinity's history around race. And we don't have any actual drama, you might say, that we know of in that sense. And so next week, we're going to go look a little bit further about this relationship between Trinity and Trinity Chapel, which becomes St. Matthias Church. We're going to be talking with the Reverend Jim Abbott, who for a number of years was the rector of St. Matthias and has written a book that I might just hold up called The Unfinished Journey, a racial history of the Diocese of Western North Carolina. And of course, you cannot write that history without a big portion of it being about Trinity Church. Since there are only a few congregations in all of Western North Carolina, Valley Crucis, Rutherfordton, Flat Rock, and then comes in Trinity Church, which quickly becomes what is known as the mother church of the area.
Right. And, we should also point out that this is a conversation that churches are increasingly having across the South, because many Episcopal churches were the churches where landowners went, and landowners held slaves in the South. And early on, even before you were here as rector, this church was addressing that history and naming that sin in its history. And perhaps it wasn't the perfect service or anything like that, but Trinity did host and participate in a service of repentance for that participation in it. And so that as kind of a step in the journey of racial healing. So this church also has a history of acknowledging that past as well, and not trying to sweep it under the rug or anything like that.
Right.
So as we're talking today, it also comes against the background of Trinity being a church that has long acknowledged that sinful institution in its past, and how we deal with that legacy as a church. So this is ongoing work that we're doing of how we wrestle with who we are and who we are becoming.
Yeah, it was in April of 2011, actually, that the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, then Catherine Jeffords Shorey, came to lead this service of repentance, healing, and reconciliation, where the then Bishop Porter Taylor expressed apology to the African American members of the church, acknowledging the truth that our history is stained by the sin of slavery and racism. And so, yes, we have been a part of that continued journey. Well, David, thank you. I think that this is just touches briefly, nonetheless, it's helpful, kind of the foundational history for us to start with as we look toward.
It's not the definitive history.
It's not definitive history, but it's starting history. And then we're going to look, as I say, next week, a little bit more in detail about this relationship between Trinity and St. Matthias. And then we're going to look even more at our presence and participation in the civil rights era. And then that is going to be part of the history of race in Asheville as well. So thank you. Please, we look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place, for the continuation of this Lenten series. May God bless you.